3 years ago, almost to the day when I wrote this script, Digibro released a vlog titled Objectively Good Doesn't Fucking Exist, and this video changed my entire outlook on media. It wasn't as though I'd been on the other side of the argument, considering my inability to find enjoyment in Kill La Kill where everyone else I talked to seemed to consider it a masterpiece, but the feeling had mostly been subconscious, and Digi's explanation in more concrete terms solidified the idea into a form which I could actually apply to my viewing experiences. This base concept of subjectivity and critique has ricocheted into a variety of more specific approaches I now take with analysis, one of which I'm going to cover now. Because even if the logical mind can understand the principle of subjectivity in art, it is not fully satisfying for many of us to simply experience a sensation of good, leading to a search for an answer to the ever-persistent question of why is it good? The emotional part of our attachment to a work seems at war with the logical desire to understand the exact nature of that attachment. This attitude is the birthplace of analysis, and one of the first answers analysis will arrive at in an examination of media is quality of execution, a grade of its resonance with an audience, or the ability of a work to translate its ideas to reality. Discussing how a work executes its ideas is usually the beginning of analysis because of its similarities to the holistic experience. Like how the holistic experience encompasses the broad emotional reception someone feels from a work in its totality, execution considers the elements of a work's construction under the lens of how they service the perceived end goal of said work. Rather than examine, say, the exact details of how notes in a song lead to a particular type of upcoming narrative beat, execution considers how the song in totality adds to the mood or tone on a broader scale. And this larger scope of examination is why it is typically the first kind of analysis those with a proclivity for it engage in. To understand execution requires no specific technical knowledge, nor a massive wealth of experience in the medium of the work being analyzed. Equally, it is not as though execution as a point of analysis is less valuable for its lack of focus on detail, as even the most beautiful, most expertly crafted piece of music will ring hollow if used incorrectly. Execution is everything for a good piece of media, as it can be used to not only answer that ever-invasive question of why, but also because its multiplicity in giving that answer can so fully and succinctly cover all of a work's distinct properties. And additionally, good execution can often provide a jumping-off point for research into specific elements to evolve an analysis into the more educational and detailed variety that I mentioned before. To demonstrate exactly how vital good execution is to a work's quality and how critical a good understanding of execution is to analysis, I'm going to discuss a piece of media occupying a space I have never done analysis in before, nor in which I have much experience as a participant. I'm going to look at a game, specifically a Nintendo 64 racing game from 1999. That's right, we're going to talk about the execution of Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, and why I still love playing this game. In order to talk properly about how well this game is executed, we have to understand what the end goal of the game is. What is it supposed to make you feel? What core element does it need to nail that keeps you coming back for more? Normally, this conclusion can be more effectively drawn after taking note of the many components of a work's construction and finding where they share a common purpose. However, in this game, due to its genre and setting, we know exactly what it's shooting for. This. This is a game about going fast, and more to the point, about going fast feeling like the most badass thing in the world. It is, of course, a racing game, so we could assume the sensation of speed would at least play some role, but in many racing games, this is often not the case. So many racing games, grounded as they are in reality over fantasy, have an unfortunate tendency to overcomplicate the fun of going fast. They desire to simulate the more challenging elements of driving at high speed, seeming to forget that games as simulation is a bit of a misnomer, as no amount of fancy hardware will ever compare to actually learning the skills to drive an Aventador on the track. But being a fantasy racing game, Star Wars Racer has no basis for complexity in reality, and so must therefore rely entirely on the core appeal of racing, that of course being speed. When we enter the game from the menu screen, this feeling is maximized, as there's no attempt at a story, nor a complex tutorial explaining all the game's systems. The player is instead immediately greeted by the pod selection menu, followed by track selection, and only then is the option to explore other menus presented prior to starting the race, which is the default selection at the top. The game is minimizing obstacles to getting you down on the track, pointing to a sincere desire to give the player the fun of racing at ridiculously high speeds. But let's not forget that this is 1999 on the N64. Even though it's a console fondly regarded by many and has a library chock full of defining games for the medium, it isn't exactly remembered for graphical fidelity. So how is it that Star Wars Racer even today delivers the best sensation of speed I've ever experienced against more modern titles with all their fancy speed blur effects and more precise controls? Part of this, I think, stems from the direction that racing games have taken as time has passed and technology improved. The execution ethos of more modern racing titles has shifted to embody accurate simulation, leaving behind gamification. But even if we look at other racing titles from the same era which did have early versions of these mechanics, such as Cruisin' World, even then they never captured the same feeling of frenetic pace in the Star Wars title. Key elements to the pod racing game's execution of speed come in two primary forms: graphical manipulation and sound effect association. Of course, with the N64, the raw horsepower to create active graphic motion blurring didn't yet exist, and the game was already pushing the system's limits with track size and the detail on the player's pod. To achieve the sensation of speed, the game is instead designed under the assumption that the player never really stops moving. Even in a death-inducing crash, not only does the pod maintain momentum as it spins out of control, but the respawn camera itself moves down the track before reaching the point of the crash. It seems innocent enough a choice, but if one were to dead stop the pod in a portion of the track where movement would be normally expected, so much of the design brilliance of the game is revealed in two key forms. The primary mode by which the game achieves sensation of speed is texture repetition, both from the track guides and the environment textures themselves. Each of the game's guiding signs for sharp or long and aggressive turns are never marked, if they're marked at all, by single arrows. They are instead built from contiguous markers which accompany your pod through the whole of the obstacle or turn. Invariably, and especially in the beginning of the game when your pod doesn't have sufficient upgrades to really pull turns as tightly as possible, this causes you to come incredibly close to these markers as you blast past them. In so doing, their contrasting colors creates a flickering effect in the corner of the eye, generating a sense of exactly how quickly you are covering ground. This is repeated with structural textures as well, usually at tighter intervals, to maintain this sensation even through relatively straight or wide sections of track. None of these elements change your speed, only heighten your sensitivity to the relative motion of your pod to the static images around you. This increase in perception of relativity is crucial since if viewed from a wider angle, which the game weirdly gives you access to, you will notice that your pod isn't moving all that fast, just that the tracks themselves are rather small. Secondly, rather than try to develop some way to create motion blur on the track textures or merely not pay them any mind and keep them as crisp as possible, textures on track walls and surfaces close to the pod itself are distorted. Where textures in parts of the track where the pod is not able to go or in the foreground are as clean as N64 graphics were for the time, everything in the immediate area of the track is defocused and horizontally stretched out of proportion. While creating a gross mess of visuals under static examination, in the midst of a race, this creates the illusion of higher speeds while still keeping the pod controllable even with fewer actual racing game mechanics. Because as soon as you notice this fact, you realize your pod isn't going all that much faster relative to the track size than any of the cars in something like Cruisin' World. It just feels like you are because the game's design has brilliant execution even with limited means. Sound design in the game also significantly contributes to the execution of speed simulation. So much so, in fact, that if we experience a track with sound, and now without, there is an immediately perceivable difference in how fast it feels we are traveling. The use of thrumming engine oscillation sounds and harsh brake noise effects have been staples of racing games since their inception, as they capture the most distinctive sounds we associate with high-powered cars, and Star Wars Racer is no exception in this regard. But where the game really homes in on this element is in the boost sound effect and the other sounds which accompany it. All of the other engine sounds in the game are more reserved and passive, layered under Windrush and the score. They exist to add a fullness to the experience, rather than adding to any one particular element of the gameplay, and are not easily identifiable as being pulled directly from the film. The boost sound, though, of which there are two variants which alternate every time you engage boost, drowns out everything else in the soundscape and is drawn directly from the sounds used during the race in the film. This is hugely important to communicating speed due to the one-to-one player association of the sound as it appears in the game to the sound as it appears in the movie. Though used frequently during the pod race sequence, the sound occurs almost always when Anakin seems to push his pod just above its limit to make a clean pass or escape a crash. And most notably, it is heard for a final time at the end of the race when he rips his and Sebulba's pods apart, sending his rival's machine into an uncontrolled wipeout and surging himself ahead to the finish line. In each of the points where it is heard in the film, it is in communication of progression through effective, timely use of high speed. When then used in the game as the boosting sound signal, we as players are immediately reminded of those events in the movie. Coupled with all the other small changes in the game which occur during boost, the sound is used to tie the emotional response of inching closer and closer to victory from the movie into that of the game. This then naturally contributes to our sense of speed incrementally over the course of a race, and is why every track always has the ability to perform a significant stretch of boost prior to crossing the lap line in simulation of the end of the race in the film. But the boost itself is not the only use of sound to audibly communicate speed. In this game, boost obviously doesn't last forever, even if there are some tracks where I wish it would to cut down my post-game lap times. No, the game limits boost with a heat and cooldown mechanic, which, if ignored, causes one of your nacelles to catch fire and necessitates repair. Once again, the game uses associative resonance to sounds and scenes from the film to warn you this time about loss of speed. As you approach the upper limit of your boost time, a rapid warning beep will cut in, indicating you should disengage boost soon to avoid damage. It seems a pretty stock sound in all honesty, but stock or not, it is the exact same one used in the film when Anakin's own pod catches fire, and he must slow down to refire the affected engine. This anomaly nearly costs Anakin the race, and in the game, excessive repair times will cost you your race. This associative sound use, instead of contributing directly to your sense of present speed, reiterates how bad a loss of speed will be, and helps ensure you run the race at a higher average pace. Do you see what I mean? Effectively executing these two components of design so well has allowed this game to remain engaging and satisfying even 20 years after its release. And I could go on and on about all its other expertly built components within the confines of the N64's abilities. Things like how the 25 tracks are actually only 9 maps with changing access gates, the upgrade system and how it can be used to create certain pod builds, and how the game has a slew of more advanced movement mechanics, none of which are required to have fun or beat the game. But that's the power of execution as a judgment of quality and point of analysis. Execution is everything not because it can or does envelop all part of a piece of media, and not even because it's an easy point of entry into analysis itself. Execution is everything because it cuts to the heart of the point, of the difference between ideal and reality, and why that gap is often the reason a work is considered good or bad. Catch you on the flip side.